The year 1889 coughed its last breath into the biting Scottish air, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, peat smoke, and a nascent, unsettling dread. In the remote, wind-scoured reaches of Ravenbrook, a name whispered more than spoken, a tragedy unfolded that would forever stain the Highlands with a chilling question. Where did they go? Not one, nor two, but an entire orphanage full of children, swallowed by the night as if the very land had opened its maw and consumed them whole. Ravenbrook Orphanage, a gaunt, unyielding structure of gray stone, stood sentinel over a desolate glen, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the moors. It was a place born of necessity, erected by a stoic, unyielding church in an era when poverty and disease culled families with ruthless efficiency. For decades, it had served its grim purpose, housing the unwanted, the parentless, the small, silent sufferers of fate's cruel hand. These were children accustomed to hardship, to thin gruel and colder comfort, yet beneath their stoic exteriors beat hearts that yearned, however faintly, for warmth, for kindness, for a future that might offer more than the stark reality of their present. The evening of December 14, 1889, began like any other. A day etched in the memories of the few who still dared to speak of Ravenbrook, though their words were always accompanied by a shiver, a furtive glance over the shoulder. Inside the orphanage, the muted clatter of spoons against earthenware bowls would have punctuated the evening meal. Sister Agnes, a woman whose stern visage belied a deeply buried compassion, would have presided over the long, rough-hewn tables, ensuring each child received their meager portion of broth and bread. Her voice, usually sharp with instruction, might have softened slightly as she observed the youngest, their small hands struggling with oversized spoons, their eye fixed on the simple, hot food. After supper, the routine would have continued with an almost ritualistic precision. Lessons in scripture, perhaps a monotonous recital of arithmetic tables, followed by the quiet preparation for bed. The older girls, with their nimble fingers, would have helped the younger ones with buttons and laces, their movements practiced and economical. Laughter would have been a rare, fleeting sound within those thick stone walls, quickly stifled, an indulgence ill-suited to their somber existence. The dominant sound, surely, would have been the wind, a constant, mournful companion, whistling through the eaves, rattling the ill-fitting window panes, a ceaseless lament for the sorrows held within. As darkness descended completely, a profound quiet would have settled over the orphanage, broken only by the crackle of a dying fire in the common room and the soft rhythmic breathing of 24 sleeping children. The air, perpetually laced with the scent of damp stone and stale wool, would have grown heavy with the unspoken weight of their dreams and their burdens. Outside, the Scottish night would have been a vast, inky canvas, dotted by the infrequent piercing cries of nocturnal birds and dominated by the ceaseless, ancient murmur of the glen. Nothing stirred. Nothing hinted at the profound rupture that was about to occur. An act of silent, terrifying vanishing that would defy all logic, all reason, and all belief. The world would wake the next morning to an empty building, a silence so profound it seemed to scream, and a mystery that would stretch across generations, touching everything it passed with a cold, spectral finger. The breakfast, still warm on the tables, would be the only witness, a silent, steaming indictment of an impossible absence. What force, known or unknown, could possibly orchestrate such a complete erasure? The question who hung in the frigid air, a spectral presence that would haunt Ravenbrook for well over a century, refusing to be dismissed, demanding an answer that would never come. And as the last embers died in the orphanage hearth, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to swallow the very furniture, the stage was set for a disappearance that would etch itself into the darkest corners of Scotland's folklore. A tale of children lost not to death, but to an unfathomable void. The dawn of December 15th brought with it no fanfare, no celestial omen, only the same biting cold and the same relentless wind. It was a wind, however, that now seemed to carry a different note, a high, thin whisper of a sound that no one was yet close enough to hear. The first to discover the impossible was Mr. Alistair McTavish, the local baker. It was his daily ritual, a journey he had made for 15 years, to deliver the fresh, still warm loaves of bread to the orphanage, his sturdy handcart groaning under their weight. The morning was still swathed in a pre-dawn gloom as he approached the front gates, their rusted hinges singing a familiar complaint. But something was wrong. The gate, normally latched with an old iron pin, hung slightly ajar. Puzzled, Mr. McTavish nudged it open, his brow furrowing in confusion. The silence was the next thing he noticed. Not the usual quiet of a sleeping house, but an absolute, unnerving stillness. There was no smoke from the chimneys, no faint light from a kitchen lantern, no sound of stirring life. A cold dread, a premonition as sharp as a shard of glass, began to prickle the back of his neck. He pushed open the heavy oak door, which swung inward with an uncharacteristic ease, its lock hanging loose and unmolested. The air that met him was thick with a strange, unnatural warmth, a heat that felt trapped and lifeless, not the comforting warmth of a lived-in space scene. He called out, his voice a gruff, booming sound in the oppressive silence. "Sister Agnes, the bread is here!" But no answer came, only the echo of his own voice, swallowed and lost in the cavernous halls. He moved from the entrance hall to the common room, his heavy boots making a dull thud on the stone floors. The sight that met him was a paradox, a scene that defied all comprehension. On the long wooden tables sat the bowls, each one with a dollop of still steaming porridge. The bread, which he himself had delivered the night before, lay untouched beside them. The air was heavy with the scent of it, a ghost of a meal. A chair was tipped over, a single insignificant disruption in a scene of perfect, petrifying order. His heart now hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He moved with a speed he hadn't known he possessed, rushing through the cold, narrow corridors. The dormitory was next, and the sight within solidified the burgeoning terror. The beds, 24 of them, were all perfectly made. The crisp, starched white sheets were pulled tight, the small pillows fluffed and centered. There was no evidence of a struggle, no frantic, hastily made bed, no discarded blanket. It was as if the children had never existed in those beds at all. The silence was not empty. It was full, teeming with the ghosts of their absence. Mr. McTavish stumbled back out into the light, his face ashen, his hands trembling violently. He left the bread where it was and staggered back down the gravel path, the unlatched gate now a symbol of an impossible escape. The wind, which had been a constant companion, now seemed to howl with a new, terrifying intensity, a sound that carried a message far more chilling than any scream could. It spoke of a world unmoored, of children erased, of a silence that was not peace, but a monstrous, consuming vacuum. He knew then that he was the last to see Ravenbrook as it had been, and the first to see it for what it had become. An empty vessel, a monument to a disappearance that he had no explanation, no witness, and no trace. The story, now a living, breathing thing, had just begun, and the world was utterly unprepared for its chilling conclusion. The news of Ravenbrook Orphanage's impossible emptiness spread like a sickness. It was carried on the same wind that scoured the glen, whispered in hushed tones from farmstead to village, growing in size and terror with each passing mile. Sheriff Lachlan Murdoch, a man whose life had been dedicated to the mundane brutalities of the law, petty thefts, drunken brawls, the occasional all-too-human quarrel, arrived at the orphanage not with a sense of dread, but with a weary skepticism. He was a man of cold, hard facts, of logic and reason, a man who believed that every mystery had a solution, and that every solution was rooted in the visible world. He stood in the dining hall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his eyes scanning the impossible tableau before him. He saw what McTavish had seen: the untouched food, the tipped chair, the overwhelming, stifling silence. He ran a hand over the bowls, his calloused fingertips feeling the chill of the earthenware. They were cold now, but the memory of warmth, the scent of the uneaten meal, still lingered like a ghost. He walked over to the tipped chair, a single jarring note in a composition of perfect order. He righted it, his movements slow and deliberate, and then he simply stood there, in the center of the room, listening. The only sound was the far-off whistle of the wind and the loud, frantic beating of his own heart. Murdoch, a man who had seen the worst of human nature, was a student of it. He believed every act had a motivation, every disappearance a purpose. He moved through the building, his heavy boots echoing in the stillness. He checked the windows, latched from the inside, or locked and untouched. He examined the doors. The front door's lock was loose, but it showed no signs of being forced. The back door, a heavy thing of bolted iron, was secured from within. He went outside, examining the ground around the orphanage. The recent rains had left the earth soft, a perfect medium for tracks. But there was nothing. No footprints leading away, no scuff marks from a struggle, not a single broken blade of grass. He returned inside, his certainty now replaced by a chilling uncertainty, a disquiet he had never before felt. He went to the dormitory again, this time with a lantern to cut through the deepening gloom of the afternoon. He went from bed to bed, running his hands over the perfectly made sheets. They were cold, as if they had been empty for days, not hours. But the scent of a recent presence, the faint, lingering smell of clean child and stale wool, still clung to the fabric. It was a contradiction, a lie his senses could not reconcile. Later, in the failing light, as the village of Ravenbrook watched from a terrified distance, he met with a small contingent of town elders. He was a man accustomed to having answers, but on this day, he had none. He spoke with the measured cadence of a man who was struggling to believe his own words. "There is no sign," he told them, his voice low and strained. "No sign of a struggle, no evidence of a break-in, no tracks, nothing. It is as if they simply ceased to exist." He could see the fear in their eyes, the dawning comprehension of the impossibility. The verdict he delivered was simple, factual, and far more terrifying than any sensational scream could have been. The children were gone. The orphanage was empty, and there was no explanation. Only a silence so deep and so absolute it seemed to swallow the light. The fact-based world of Sheriff Murdoch, a world of logic and of reason, had been utterly and irrevocably broken. Sheriff Murdoch's grim verdict did little to soothe the mounting fear. In a world where every strange occurrence was quickly attributed to a logical explanation, a runaway child, a disgruntled employee, a family dispute, the sudden, here, unadulterated absence of evidence was the most terrifying fact of all. The townspeople, accustomed to the comforting, if at times brutal, reality of their lives, now found themselves adrift in a sea of questions with no shore in sight. The silence that had so rattled Alistair McTavish and Sheriff Murdoch now held the entire glen in its grip. The birds seemed to sing in hushed tones. The wind itself appeared to sigh with a weary deference. People began to speak in whispers, their conversations punctuated by long, anxious pauses. A chilling narrative began to form, not from a single source, but from the collective dread of a community forced to stare into a void. It was a narrative born of ancient fears and modern helplessness, a story of an unseen force, a malign entity that moved without sound, without leaving a trace, without needing to break a lock or leave a footprint. The local priest, Father Coyle, a man who had long preached on the comforting certainty of divine will, now found himself confronted by a silence that felt decidedly undivine. He led a small procession of the faithful to the orphanage, his voice trembling as he led them in prayer outside the unyielding stone walls. But even his prayers seemed to lose their power, swallowed by the oppressive quiet that emanated from the building. The very air around the orphanage seemed to grow heavy with an unspoken truth, a presence that was all the more chilling for being completely, utterly absent. It was as if the place had not merely been emptied, but had been scrubbed clean of all human life, memory, and spirit. The investigation, as far as it could be called one, stalled almost immediately. Without a crime scene, without witnesses, without so much as a single clue, there was nothing to investigate. Sheriff Murdoch, a man of action, was paralyzed by the very vacuum he had discovered. He sent for help, dispatching a rider on a borrowed horse to the nearest constabulary. But even as the rider disappeared into the distance, Murdoch knew it was a futile gesture. No amount of manpower, no clever detective work, could solve a crime that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. The children hadn't just disappeared. They had been erased. As night fell on the second day, a new fear began to take root. A fear whispered in hushed tones around hearths and in the back of pubs. If this unseen force could take 24 children without a sound, without a trace, what was to stop it from taking others? The thought hung in the air, a chilling, psychological terror that was far more powerful than any physical threat. The villagers of Ravenbrook no longer feared what they could see in the dark, but what they could not see in the light. Their homes, once places of comfort and security, now felt like fragile shells, easily breached, easily emptied. The sound of a door creaking, the sudden draft of a window, the wind moaning outside, each became a harbinger of a monstrous invisible power, a force that had proven its existence with an undeniable, terrifying absence. And in the heart of that terrifying vacuum, the memory of 24 missing children became a collective weight, a ghostly presence that would forever stand sentinel over the glen. In a story of such overwhelming emptiness, it is often the smallest details that carry the greatest weight. And so it was with the chilling exception to the orphanage's silence, a lone, terrified boy named Finn. At 8 years old, Finn was the youngest resident of Ravenbrook, a quiet child with eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrows of the world. On the night of the disappearance, a debilitating fever had him confined not in the main dormitory, but in a small, isolated room near Sister Agnes's quarters, a place where his restless coughing would not disturb the other children. It was in this small room that a local woman, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, a volunteer nurse, found him 3 days after the disco. She had come to the orphanage to assist in the grim search, clinging to a desperate, fading hope. She entered his room and found him huddled beneath a pile of blankets, shivering not from the fever, which had broken, but from a profound and bone-deep terror. He was silent, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance, his small body coiled in a posture of petrified flight. Mrs. Finch, a kind-hearted woman with a gentle touch, knelt beside the bed and spoke to him in soft, comforting tones. She offered him a cup of warm milk, but he refused, his hands trembling violently. It was only after an hour of patient, silent companionship that he finally began to speak. His voice was a thin, reedy whisper, barely audible above the constant hum of the wind. He spoke of a strange light, not the cold, sterile light of the moon, but a soft, shimmering luminescence that had seeped under his door. He had watched it with a child's frightened curiosity, a light that seemed to pulse and hum with an ethereal, unsettling song. He heard no screams, no sounds of a struggle, only the sudden, absolute silence of the children's dormitory, a silence that had fallen as one and had been so complete it had made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. He described a feeling, not of fear, but of an overwhelming, irresistible pull, a sensation that the air was being drawn from the room and that the light was singing a promise of a better place, a place free of cold floors and thin gruel. He had felt his own body begin to rise from the bed, a terrifying, effortless ascent, until a sudden violent cough had broken the spell and he had fallen back to the cot, the fever sweat a cold wash on his skin. The light had then faded, and the silence had remained. He had spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended terror, too afraid to move, too afraid to even utter a sound. He had heard the voices of he men searching, but his fear had rendered him mute, a small, terrified animal in a stone cage. Mrs. Finch relayed his fragmented, terrifying account to Sheriff Murdoch, who listened with a growing sense of dread. The boy's story was not a rational one, not one that fit within the confines of his understanding. But it was the only account they had, the only glimpse into that silent, terrifying night. It offered no solution, only a new layer of a deepening, impossible mystery. It suggested not a human abduction, but something altogether different, something that moved on a scale that defied their very reality. It spoke of a silent, luminous tide that had risen and taken everything, leaving only a single, terrified witness to whisper its unholy truth. Finn's account, though chilling, was met with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a grim skepticism. Sheriff Murdoch, despite the cold knot of dread in his own stomach, felt compelled to find a more logical explanation. He interviewed the parents of the missing children, a desperate, heart-wrenching process that yielded nothing but tears and a profound, aching grief. He spoke with the few locals who had ever been inside the orphanage, trying to uncover any rumor, any hint of discord or unusual behavior. But the answers were always the same. Sister Agnes was a strict but devout woman. The children, though quiet and subdued, were well behaved. There was no secret passage, no known tunnel, no hidden door. The orphanage, they all insisted, was just a building, a gaunt, functional place that had simply disappeared from the world's notice. The only person who seemed to truly understand the weight of Finn's words was Mrs. Finch. She spent hours with the boy, drawing out the fragments of his memory, piecing together a terrifying, impossible tapestry. He spoke of the light again, a light that had no source, and of the feeling it had brought with it, a feeling he could only describe as an overwhelming, unearthly peace. He remembered the feeling of being pulled upward, a sensation of weightlessness and a profound, all-encompassing calm that had been more terrifying than any scream. He described seeing the faces of the other children, not in a state of terror, but of serenity, as if they were all willingly, peacefully, accepting their fate. Murdoch, a man of fact, had to contend with the growing body of supernatural folklore that was now swirling around the tragedy. Stories of ancient Celtic spirits, of restless fae, of a silent tide that came for the lonely and the lost. He dismissed them all with a weary sigh, but the tales took on a life of their own, growing more elaborate, more terrifying with each retelling. The glen itself began to earn a new, more sinister reputation. People avoided the road to Ravenbrook, taking long detours through rougher terrain, just to avoid the chilling silence that emanated from the place. The orphanage stood as a stark, unblinking monument to the town's collective terror. Its windows, once merely glass, now felt like 1,000 eyes staring out at a world that no longer made sense. The tipped chair was left untouched as a grim reminder of an impossible crime. The cold bowls of porridge a testament to a meal never finished. The investigation officially remained open, but everyone knew it was over before it had even truly begun. The case of the Vanishing Orphans was not one for law enforcement. It was a case for whispers, for legends, for a slow psychological unraveling of a community's grip on reality. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a bleak Scottish winter, the silence of Ravenbrook began to feel not like an absence, but like a chilling living presence, an entity that waited, watched, and promised a mystery that would never, ever be solved. The calendar pages turned, but the chilling tableau at Ravenbrook remained frozen in time. The orphanage, now cordoned off by a length of rough rope, became a grim pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious and the deeply fearful. Locals, their faces etched with a new kind of weary resignation, would stand at a respectful distance, their eyes fixed on the gaunt gray stone walls. They came not for answers, but for a shared sense of dread, for the cold, unspoken comfort of knowing they were not alone in their terror. For Sheriff Murdoch, the case had become a personal torment. It was a wound that refused to close. He returned to the orphanage day after day, his presence a ghost of his former confident self. He walked the same halls, traced the same walls, stared at the same perfectly made beds and the same undisturbed dinner table. He had become a man obsessed, not with finding the children, but with understanding the impossibility of their absence. He began to see patterns where there were none, to imagine faint, spectral impressions on the dust of the floorboards. The silence of the place began to feel like a living thing, a malevolent presence that toyed with his sanity, whispering questions he could never answer. He would catch himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see a small, pale face peering from a window, a single silent witness to the truth. The only person who seemed to draw any sense of meaning from the tragedy was the local elder, Old Man McGregor. He was a man of the earth, steeped in the ancient lore of the Highlands, a man who saw the world not through the lens of modern progress, but through the enduring lens of myth and legend. He believed the children were not gone, but taken. He spoke of the fallen, an old, almost forgotten legend of an entity that took not life, but essence, leaving the body behind as an empty husk. But this time, he whispered, the fallen had found a way to take the body as well, to leave not a single physical trace. He believed the children's laughter was not truly gone, but simply moved to another place, an invisible parallel world that touched their own only in moments of profound stillness. He told stories of the glen itself, of the ancient spirits that lived beneath the moor, of the thin places where the veil between worlds grew fragile. He spoke of the children of Ravenbrook as unclaimed, too young to have been fully marked by the world, too innocent to have a lasting physical tie to it. It was this lack of a strong tie, he posited, that had made them so easy to take, so effortless to pull across the unseen boundary. His words, though dismissed by the few remaining skeptics, took on a chilling weight. They gave a name to the terror, a chilling narrative to the impossible. The children were not dead, the stories said. They were just elsewhere. And the place they had left behind was now a gateway, a wound in the fabric of reality that would never, ever heal. The nights in Ravenbrook grew longer, darker, and more frightening. The local constable, a young man named Ewan, swore he heard the faint sound of children's voices on the wind, a sound so ethereal it could have been a figment of his imagination, a cruel trick of the gale. The families of the missing, their grief now hardened into a cold, unending dread, would sometimes leave small trinkets and toys outside the orphanage walls, a desperate offering to a force they could not understand, a silent plea to the unseen entities that now seemed to own the land. The community was no longer a collection of individuals, but a single, collective body bound by a shared, unspeakable horror, a fear that had burrowed deep into their souls and had no intention of ever leaving. The legend of the Thin Place was not new to Scotland, but in the wake of the Ravenbrook tragedy, it took on a terrifying new relevance. Old Man McGregor, with his gnarled hands and eyes that held the history of the moors, spoke of places where the veil between worlds grew fragile, where the barrier between the physical and the ethereal was as thin as a single breath. The glen, he whispered to anyone who would listen, had always been a thin place, a spot where the world of mortals was perilously close to the world of the ancient spirits, a place where a person might step sideways and simply disappear. For Finn, the sole survivor, this was not a matter of folklore, but of terrifying, lived experience. The fever that had kept him from the main dormitory now seemed a blessing, a cruel twist of fate that had both saved him and condemned him to a knowledge no child should possess. He continued to speak of the light, but his description grew more detailed, more unnerving. It was not a source of light, he insisted, but an absence of shadow. It was a luminosity that devoured the darkness, leaving a cold, clean brightness in its wake. He spoke of the humming, a sound that was not in his ears but in his bones, a frequency that resonated with a profound, unearthly power. He would stare into the distance, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to be a constant companion, and whisper about the song. It was the song, he believed, that had beckoned the other children, a siren call to a place of perfect peace, a place where hunger and cold could not follow. The psychological toll on the villagers of Ravenbrook was immense. The rational world, with its comforting laws of cause and effect, had been shattered. They now lived in a world where children could be spirited away by an unseen force, where the very ground beneath their feet could be a doorway to an incomprehensible reality. Mothers held their children closer, their gazes filled with a new kind of quiet desperation. The sound of a child's laughter was no longer a simple joy, but a fragile, terrifying thing. A sound that seemed to taunt the unseen forces, a beacon that might draw their attention. Sheriff Murdoch, in his fruitless pursuit of a logical answer, had the orphanage formally closed and boarded up. The locals, however, saw this not as an act of securing the building, but of sealing a wound. They believed the boards and nails were a desperate, futile attempt to hold a terrifying truth at bay, to prevent a new wave of disappearances. The orphanage was no longer just a building. It was a mausoleum of the lost, a monument to a terrifying, unsolvable enigma. As the days grew shorter and the winds of winter howled across the moors, the mystery of the vanishing orphans of Ravenbrook became more than a local legend. It became a chilling, enduring question, a testament to the fragile line between the known and the unknown. The unanswered questions now hung in the air like a perpetual mist, clinging to the cold stone walls and seeping into the collective consciousness of a town that would never again know true peace. For in the silence of that desolate glen, the only thing that remained was the chilling echo of a disappearance that defied all logic, and a single terrified boy who knew a little too much about the humming light. The official inquiry into the Ravenbrook disappearances was a slow, bureaucratic death. Investigators from Edinburgh arrived with their leather-bound notebooks and their detached air of professional skepticism. They spoke with Sheriff Murdoch, their expressions a mixture of pity and a barely concealed condescension. They listened to his account of the untouched food, the unforced locks, the lack of footprints. They walked the silent halls of the orphanage and peered into the empty beds. Their scientific minds, however, could not reconcile the physical evidence with the metaphysical silence. They dismissed Finn's story as a child's fevered fantasy, a product of a weak mind and a terrifying experience. The light, the humming, the feeling of a peaceful ascent, all of it was categorized as the unreliable testimony of a traumatized boy. They wrote it down, of course, but it was filed away as a footnote, a curious detail rather than a central clue. The investigators, men of logic and reason, were incapable of accepting a truth that lay beyond the realm of the tangible. Their final report, a sterile document filled with jargon and procedural language, came to a frustrating and utterly unsatisfying conclusion. The children of Ravenbrook Orphanage, along with their guardian, Sister Agnes, have disappeared without a trace. All signs of forced entry, struggle, or foul play are absent. The case is considered an open, unsolvable mystery. This conclusion, rather than providing closure, only deepened the town's unease. The official stamp of unsolvable felt like a surrender to the unseen. It validated the growing fear that the disappearance was not a matter for human law or logic, but for something ancient and unknowable. The report's cold, rational language stood in stark contrast to the living, breathing terror that now permeated Ravenbrook. Sheriff Murdoch's professional length fee was over. The case of the vanishing orphans had broken him, turning a man of facts into a man consumed by an unsolvable mystery. He spent his days rereading the report, searching for a single word, a single sentence that might provide a thread to pull on, a sign that the Edinburgh investigators had seen what he had seen. But there was nothing. Just the cold finality of a case closed, a life's work undone by an impossible event. The orphanage itself became a kind of open secret, a place no one spoke of directly, but everyone thought about constantly. It stood as a grim testament to the town's greatest failure, a permanent monument to a terrifying, invisible power. The cold, unblinking windows of the building seemed to watch over the town, a constant reminder of the day the world had irrevocably changed. The villagers now lived not just with a memory, but with a palpable presence, a chill that seemed to emanate from the stone walls, a silent promise that in the desolate corners of the world, some things are simply not meant to be found. And the children of Ravenbrook, in their perfect, silent absence, had become a permanent part of the landscape, a ghostly echo in the heart of the glen. The town of Ravenbrook, once a simple, quiet place, was now defined by its great, unspoken wound. The children's disappearance was the dark star around which all local life now orbited. The villagers, once so self-sufficient, had become a community of watchers. They watched their own children with a new, frantic anxiety, their eyes following them in the street, their ears straining for their voices, as if at any moment, they too might be pulled away by the invisible tide. The psychological horror began to manifest in tangible ways. Strange, subtle occurrences started to plague the people of Ravenbrook. A mother would wake to find her child's bed perfectly, impossibly made, the sheets tucked with a chilling precision she herself had not applied. A father would return from the fields to find the dinner bowls on the table laid out, ready for a meal, despite his wife having sworn they were put away hours ago. The occurrences were small, almost insignificant, but they were consistent and they were chilling. It was as if the children, in their perfect, unsettling absence, had left behind a kind of haunting, a spectral residue of their last moments. The town was not being visited by ghosts. It was being visited by an echo. Sheriff Murdoch, now a man without a purpose, found a new, terrible obsession. He began to catalog these strange events, a grim and futile attempt to find a pattern in the chaos. He spoke with the terrified townspeople, his voice now gentle and understanding, his skepticism replaced by a weary acceptance of the impossible. He listened to the woman who swore she heard the faint sound of a child's lullaby coming from the empty orphanage at dusk. He listened to the man who found a single, small wooden toy, carved with the initials of a missing orphan, sitting on his doorstep. These were not the actions of ghosts. They were the actions of a presence, a force that was toying with them, a subtle, cold reminder that the children were still, in some unknowable way, there. The orphanage itself had become a kind of black hole of reality. Birds would not land on its roof. The wildflowers that grew so profusely elsewhere on the moor seemed to wither and turn black at its base. The silence that came from the building was not the quiet of emptiness, but the profound quiet of something waiting. Old Man McGregor, with his deep-seated key, knowledge of the old ways, insisted that the children were now unmarked, that they were no longer bound by the laws of the mortal world. Their presence, he said, was a living, breathing testament to their existence in another realm. He believed the strange occurrences were not malicious, but were the children's final, desperate attempts to reach back, to let their loved ones know they were still, in some way, alive. But in Ravenbrook, a town built on the certainties of hardship and endurance, the chilling, ambiguous hope of their presence was far more terrifying than the certainty of their death. The townspeople were now living in a world where the laws of nature had been bent, where the living were haunted not by the dead, but by the perfectly, impossibly missing. And as winter tightened its grip on the glen, the silence of Ravenbrook became a permanent part of the landscape, a chilling, psychological monument to a great, unspeakable truth. The years bled into one another, turning the raw terror of the Ravenbrook tragedy into a brittle historical dread. Sheriff Murdoch, his spirit broken and his mind consumed by the case, retired to a quiet life, a haunted man who spent his days staring out at the moors, forever searching for a sign that would never come. Finn, the sole survivor, grew up in the care of Mrs. Finch. He was a quiet, withdrawn boy, his childhood marked not by games and laughter, but by the relentless hum of a light that only he could remember. As time marched on, the story of the Vanishing Orphans passed from recent memory into the realm of folklore and legend. It was spoken of in hushed tones, a local ghost story told to frighten children into obedience. But for a few, the mystery never lost its power. One such person was a meticulous archivist in Edinburgh named Elias Croft. His work, a life of quiet obsession with the unsolved and the forgotten, led him to the sterile report on the Ravenbrook case. He read Sheriff Murdoch's despairing notes, the detailed list of impossibilities, and felt a cold professional curiosity turn into a deep, consuming fascination. Croft was a man of the 20th century, a man who believed in the power of records and the certainty of documentation. He believed every story had a source, and every disappearance a paper trail. He traveled to Ravenbrook, and, with permission from the now elderly Sheriff Murdoch, began to pore over every scrap of paper related to the orphanage. He looked at the daily ledgers, the supply manifests, the church records, and the birth certificates of the children. It was in the meticulous, mundane details that he found a strange, recurring pattern. The orphanage, he discovered, was not a place of random placement. The children, all 24 of them, had something in common. They had all been orphaned not by disease or accident, but by a chilling uniform cause. Their parents had all been declared unfit and had subsequently been institutionalized or had simply disappeared. Their backgrounds were all tainted by a shared, familial instability, a common thread of mental frailty or inexplicable behavior that had led to their being taken into care. He also found a single haunting detail that was not present in the official report. A final entry in Sister Agnes's ledger, dated December 14th, 1889. The handwriting, usually neat and precise, was spidery and rushed. It simply read, "They are here. The quiet is a promise." Croft knew then that this was not a random act of fate. The children had been chosen. Their backgrounds, their lack of a strong, connected family, made them, in some unholy way, the perfect subjects for a grand, terrible experiment. Sister Agnes's note was a horrifying revelation. It suggested she had known what was coming, that she had understood the nature of the quiet that had come for them. He archivist's work turned the simple folklore of a ghost story into something far more chilling and precise. A premeditated act, an orchestrated disappearance that was not a product of chance, but of a design so chilling and so vast that it defied all comprehension. The children of Ravenbrook were not simply victims of a strange event. They were, in some profound and terrifying way, a harvest. And the nature of that harvest, of the force that had targeted these specific children and left behind only a perfect, silent absence, was a new, far more terrifying mystery. The archivist, Elias Croft, now saw the story of the Vanishing Orphans not as a mystery, but as a puzzle of monstrous proportions. Sister Agnes's final cryptic note, "They are here. The quiet is a promise," haunted him. It suggested a complicity, an understanding that defied all logic. Croft's meticulous research led him to a dusty, forgotten corner of the Edinburgh Municipal Archive. He was searching for any record of the orphanage's construction, any hint of its purpose beyond a simple place of charity. He found the original blueprints, brittle with age and smelling faintly of mildew. They were unremarkable, detailing a standard functional design for a building of its type. But tucked into a small sealed envelope at the back of the file were the private notes of the architect, a man named Thomas Abernathy. Abernathy was known for his eccentric beliefs and his fascination with ancient esoteric traditions. He had been an avid student of what he called energetic architecture, the idea that a building could be more than just stone and mortar, that it could be designed to channel or contain unseen forces. Abernathy's notes were a descent into madness. They spoke of a luminous current that ran beneath the earth, a silent, pervasive energy that he believed the ancient Celts had been able to tap into. He referred to Ravenbrook Glen as a nexus, a place where this current was particularly strong, a place where the barrier between the mundane and the ethereal was at its most porous. The orphanage, he wrote in spidery, frantic script, was not just a building, it was an anchor, a structure designed to stabilize and draw upon this energy. He spoke of the need for conduits, of using the innocence and psychic stillness of orphaned children to focus this current, to create a perfect, silent, and undisturbed reservoir. His final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand just before his own mysterious, unrecorded disappearance, was a single terrifying line. "The conduits are prepared. The harvest is ready." The words sent a shiver of profound dread down Croft's spine. The story had just taken a horrifying turn from a chilling supernatural mystery into a premeditated ritualistic act. The children were not random victims. They were chosen for their very essence, for their lack of strong ties to the world. They were, in the eyes of this madman, the perfect, unblemished vessels for a cosmic experiment. Croft closed the file, the brittle pages feeling like an unbearable weight in his hands. He now understood Sister Agnes's final note. She had not been a victim, but an accomplice. She had known the purpose of the orphanage, had understood the chilling nature of its true design. She had watched the children, not with love, but with the cold, detached eye of a farmer tending a crop, waiting for the day of the harvest. The peaceful ascent Finn had described, the eerie calm that had fallen over the children, was not a sign of fear, but of an unimaginable, unearthly serenity that was part of the plan. Croft knew then that this was a crime that could never be solved by a police report or a witness testimony. The children of Ravenbrook had not been taken by a ghost or a spirit. They had been taken by a force that had been invited in, a power summoned by a man's chilling belief and facilitated by a woman's grim, unyielding faith. The silence of the orphanage was not an absence, but a presence, a silent, terrifying success. Elias Croft's discovery of the architect's notes shattered his professional detachment. He was no longer a dispassionate observer of history. He was a terrified witness to a meticulously planned, ritualistic horror. He returned to Ravenbrook, not with a logical checklist, but with a new, horrifying purpose. He wanted to understand the nature of the luminous current and the unseen force. He believed the answers, if they existed at all, were not in dusty archives, but in the very fabric of the glen itself. He sought out Old Man McGregor, the local elder, the only person who had ever spoken of the event in terms of ancient lore rather than human crime. McGregor, now frail and on the cusp of his own departure from the world, listened to Croft's trembling account of the architect's notes. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a piercing clarity. He nodded slowly, his gnarled fingers tracing a pattern on the table. He told Croft that the luminous current was the echo, an ancient, pervasive energy that connected all living things, a silent song that had existed long before man. He said the architect was a fool, a man of modern hubris who believed he could contain a force that was as old as the mountains themselves. "He tried to make a funnel," McGregor whispered, his voice thin as smoke. "He gathered the children, the unrooted ones, the ones who had no anchor to this world, to pull the echo through. But he was wrong. It was not a funnel. It was a door." Croft felt a cold chill run down his spine. McGregor explained that the architect had not channeled the energy, but had created a descent, a one-way passage for the echo to enter the mortal world, and for the children to be drawn into it. The peacefulness Finn had described was not a sign of acceptance, but of being absorbed, of their very essence being saubauduyen, allowed by the luminous current. Their bodies, their physical forms, were not stolen. They were simply dissolved, their matter converted back into pure, raw energy. They were not dead, nor were they elsewhere. They were now a part of the humming, silent force that ran beneath the earth. The psychological weight of this new understanding was unbearable. It was a cosmic horror, a terrifying thought that transcended simple abduction or murder. The children of Ravenbrook had been transformed into a living, breathing part of the land itself. Their silent presence was not a haunting, but a terrifying reality. They were in the air, in the soil, in the very wind that howled through the glen. They had become the quiet, a silent, eternal song that no one could hear, but everyone could feel. As Croft stood on the moors, staring at the gaunt, gray walls of the orphanage, he no longer saw a building. He saw a wound, a terrible gash in the fabric of reality, a place where a man's obsession had unleashed a force that could never be contained. The mystery of the Vanishing Orphans was not about where they went, but about what they became. And in that terrifying final understanding, Elias Croft knew that he was now a part of the story, a new, living witness to a silence that would forever echo in the hills of Ravenbrook. Elias Croft, now a man burdened with an unbearable knowledge, could not simply walk away from Ravenbrook. The silence of the glen was no longer a mystery to him. It was a constant, humming truth. He spent his days in the village, a quiet observer of the town's slow, agonizing decay. He watched as the families of the missing, their grief now hardened into a cold, unending torment, lived out their lives in a state of suspended agony. They never truly moved on, never truly healed. Their missing children were a phantom limb, a constant aching presence that was both everywhere and nowhere. Finn, the sole survivor, was now a young man, but his eyes still held the terror of an 8-year-old. He lived a quiet, solitary life, his mind forever replaying the memory of the humming light. He was the living, breathing link to the impossible, a human conduit to a terrifying truth. He and Croft, two men separated by a generation but united by a shared, unbearable secret, found a strange companionship in their solitude. They would sit for hours, staring out at the moor, speaking in low, clipped tones, trading theories and fears that no one else in the world could comprehend. Croft's obsession deepened. He believed the children's transformation was not a final act, but a state of being. He was haunted by the idea that their essence, now part of the luminous current, might still be able to interact with the world. He began to research the architect's notes again, searching for any clue to the mechanism that had brought about the disappearance. He discovered a single, disturbing detail. The architect had meticulously calculated the precise date of the disappearance, a specific alignment of the moon and stars that he believed would strengthen the current and make the descent possible. It was a date that would not occur again for another 65 years. Croft knew then that the mystery of Ravenbrook was not just a historical tragedy, but a ticking clock. He believed that the date, the anniversary of the disappearance, was a key, a moment when the veil between worlds would once again be at its thinnest. He believed the children's essence, now a part of the echo, would be drawn to the surface, pulled back to the place where their journey began. The return, he knew, would not be a physical one. It would be a chilling, terrifying echo of the original event, a moment of profound psychological dread. As the years passed, Croft and Finn became the lone guardians of the truth, two solitary figures who waited in the desolate glen for a second vanishing, a chilling final act that would confirm the architect, CT's monstrous legacy. They watched the calendar, their hearts hammering with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. The children of Ravenbrook were not gone forever. They were simply waiting for the right moment to return, not as living, breathing children, but as a silent, invisible presence, a chilling echo that would forever haunt the hills of Scotland. The day arrived, a chill wind marking the 65th anniversary of the vanishing. Elias Croft, now an old man with a stoop and a tired certainty in his eyes, stood on the moor with Finn, his face a map of decades of unspoken fear. The sky was the same bruised purple as it had been on that long-ago night. The air was heavy with an electric stillness, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. They had chosen a vantage point on a low hill where they could see the entire glen, where the gaunt gray shape of the orphanage stood like a tombstone in the fading light. Finn, whose mind had been a silent recorder of the event for all these years, suddenly gasped. He clutched Croft's arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. "The hum," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can hear it again. It's the same." Croft felt it then, not in his ears, but in the deepest parts of his bones, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was the luminous current the mad architect had described, the silent song of the echo. It was not a malevolent sound, but one of pure, overwhelming power, a frequency that promised both profound peace and absolute annihilation. As they watched, a strange light began to seep from the ground around the orphanage, a soft, ethereal glow that painted the stone walls in a pale, spectral hue. It was not a light with a source, but an absence of shadow, a silent, creeping luminosity that swallowed the darkness. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, spreading across the moor like a ghostly tide, its gentle hum growing stronger, more insistent. Finn's hand tightened on Croft's arm. "They're coming back," he said, his voice now a single breathless word. But the children did not return in a flash of light. They did not appear as ghosts or as phantoms. Instead, the air itself began to shimmer, to writhe with an invisible, silent presence. Croft and Finn felt it, a shift in the pressure, a cold, profound weight that settled over the glen. It was not a presence that could be seen, but one that could be felt, a chilling collective consciousness that was both here and not here, everywhere and nowhere. The feeling lasted for only a few moments, a brief, terrifying communion with the unseen. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the light began to fade, the humming receded back into the earth, and the stillness returned, a silence so profound it felt like a scream. The world had not received an answer. There was no ghost, no returned child, no final satisfying resolution. Instead, the veil between worlds had simply rippled, confirming the most terrifying truth of all: that the children of Ravenbrook were not lost in time, but had simply become a part of the echo, a silent, pervasive energy that existed just beyond the reach of human perception. They were not dead. They were transformed. Elias, Croft, and Finn, the last witnesses, would live out the rest of their days with this silent, unbearable knowledge. The mystery of the Vanishing Orphans was not a story of what happened one night in 1889. It was a story of a silent, unending silence, a haunting that would continue, not with screams or chains, but with the quiet, chilling reality of a world where some things are simply not meant to be found, and a truth so terrible it can never be spoken. The silence of the glen was not a memory. It was a promise.